about the consequences of trauma, we often think about PTSD and we avoid thinking about other disorders. So let's come back here and think about PTSD and what it might be. PTSD is one of the most common outcomes of trauma. About 7% of people in the US experience PTSD at some point in time. The people who do are more likely to be women, more likely than men, and much more likely to develop chronic PTSD than men are. So 22% of women, 6% of men. Trauma first occurring at an early age and of an interpersonal nature has significantly more effects on psychological functioning, including PTSD. You know, we may be able to shake off an earthquake. It's harder to shake off the way your uncle is touching you. Most people, as seen in this figure, gradually recover from PTSD. However, more than a third of those developing PTSD experience symptoms for a prolonged period. Now, as we're thinking about PTSD, let's try a short demonstration. Pull out 3 sheets of paper. On the first one, write down the name of a close loved one. On the second one, write down their favorite activity. And write down their favorite place to go. You might also write down or just think about a secret that would be too embarrassing to share, or that very few people know about. Now, imagine that you've become a victim of the crime. Take the first sheet of paper and rip it up. Because at this point, you've learned that this person was a victim of homicide and are now dead. Rip up the second one, because you learned that the homicide occurred at a time when you were involved with something that you really enjoyed, a favorite activity. So this activity is no longer enjoyable. Third, rip up the third page. Your favorite place is gone now, because this is where the murder occurred. Now, at this point, all you have left is a secret. That's what, that secret may leave you feeling ashamed or embarrassed or guilty. And that's what we may see with PTSD. So briefly, PTSD includes an exposure to trauma, intrusion symptoms, persistent avoidance, negative alterations in cognitions and mood, marked alterations in arousal and reactivity. It lasts more than 1 month. If it lasts less than 1 month, we call this acute stress disorder. There needs to be some sort of clinically significant distress or impairment. So perhaps can't go to work, can't spend time around certain people, can't go to certain places. And it's not the effects of a substance. Now, when we're thinking about PTSD, part of what happens is that there is a systematic avoidance of certain kinds of information. We don't think about it. We don't want to listen to it. We don't want to talk about it. We don't see it. And as I've said before, avoidance in and of itself can be a problem. On the other hand, talking about it, journaling about it can be very helpful. Difficult, but helpful. One of the things that we experience with PTSD is nightmares, flashbacks, other kinds of intrusive thoughts. And so Salman Rushdie reports that 2 nights before he flew to Chautauqua, he had a dream about being attacked by a man with a spear, a gladiator in a Roman amphitheater. There was an audience roaring for blood. He was rolling around on the ground, trying to elude the gladiator's downward thrusts and screaming. It was not the first time he'd had such a dream. On 2 earlier occasions, his actual sleeping self also screaming through his body, out of bed, and he awoke as he crashed painfully to the bedroom floor. So think about this. Would this be a symptom of PTSD when the attack happened after the nightmare? So the nightmare happened 2 days before the attack. And in general, we'd say no. But what if you knew that there had been a fatwa or a religious dictum calling for his death that had taken place 35 years earlier? Would that change the way that you saw this? Would that change your conclusion here? So as we're thinking about PTSD, there's often, on the one hand, an avoidance of stimuli, related to the trauma. And on the other hand, there are these intrusive symptoms. And I think about this as sort of like the push me, pull you from Dr. Dolittle, that on the one hand, we are avoiding, and on the other hand, there's these intrusive thoughts. Let's define for a minute what it means to be avoidant. We're talking about not dealing with the issue at hand, passively focusing on eliminating the emotional response and appraising it negatively, denying or resisting or distancing, as opposed to directly dealing with it, directly dealing with your feelings and experiencing them, and making positive appraisals of the situation. In general, active approach is better than avoidance. So Tarana Burke, who is the founder of the Me Too movement, in talking about her own history of violence, said, when she thought of her experience, she didn't tend to hold her abusers accountable. She held herself to blame. In her mind, they didn't abuse me. I broke the rules. Even when she was a 7-year-old and there was a late teen abusing her. She's saying, I was the one who did something wrong. It was this thinking that, also kept me from ever identifying as a survivor. I didn't even identify as a victim. She also says, I wasn't sure how, but I believed that this, like every other bad thing that had happened to me, was somehow my fault. And think about how that self-blame may lead to additional problems. Now, remember, here are symptoms of PTSD, but we no longer have DSM in the DSM-5, we no longer have criterion A precipitating events. So we're saying exposure to trauma, but the death of a loved one. Unless it's violent or accidental, only in that case is it seen as a meeting criterion A and meeting the criteria for PTSD, witnessing an event, unless in person, violent or accidental or repeated exposure, and various life-threatening medical illnesses, unless, something unusual or catastrophic happens. As we're thinking about PTSD, what I want you to remember is it's not just a discrete event, but that it's sort of like throwing a rock into a lake and it's those series of ripples that move outward. For the perpetrator, the rape lasts this long. For the victim, as Frederick Bachman says, for the victim, it doesn't stop. And I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.